Good evening, everyone. We're calling to order the Finance Committee meeting. This is for the Finance Committee for Monday, October 17th, 2022. And for those who are dialing in on the internet, this may be about a 45-minute exercise, maybe a little bit more. So just take that in consideration when you think you want to watch the City Council. So, Director, would you take the roll?
Certainly. Mayor Pantaleon.
Here.
Chairman Morris.
Here.
Alderman Novit.
Here.
Alderman Rummel.
Here.
Alderman Notes is absent. Alderman Preschlack.
Here.
Alderman Goshgarian.
Here.
Alderman Bushman.
Here.
Alderman Weber.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have a quorum.
Very good. Going over to our agenda, the first item on the agenda is the consideration of minutes from the Finance Committee meeting held in July 18th, 2022. Any questions or comments on those minutes? Any changes? There being none, I could have a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
In a second. We need a roll call vote, I believe, Director.
We're going to take a voice vote.
For the minutes.
Roll call or voice vote?
Minutes, that's voice vote's fine. Yeah.
Voice vote is
Okay.
fine.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Being none, the minutes are approved. Thank you. Now we move on to item number 3, which is the city mission statement and the FY 2024 fiscal policy. And I'd like to just say that if you haven't read these, I encourage you. They're really good documents that the Finance Department has put together. You won't see this in many communities. This is really exceptional in terms of the transparency that is afforded in these documents, how we do our accounting and what's important in that process, so that we have a robust set of financial statements at the end of the year, and which is why we get so many awards for what we publish. So, Director, want to comment?
Thank you, Chairman Morris. This is typically the way we start our annual budget process. City Council Finance Committee considers the mission statement and the fiscal year 24 fiscal policy, which really set forth the guidelines within which we prepare the annual budget each year. Included in your packet is the Lake Forest City Government Mission Statement. Included on this slide, it was originally approved in October of 2013, and we simply ask each year for the City Council Finance Committee to affirm that mission statement. The second document is the fiscal policy. This is reviewed and updated each year and presented at the October Finance Committee meeting. The only change recommended this year relates to the investment policies. The City Council approved an amended investment policy in May of 2022. So the only change we're recommending this year is just to simply update that approval date. Otherwise, we're recommending no further changes to the fiscal policy. So this evening, we're just asking the City Council Finance Committee to affirm the city mission statement and to approve the fiscal year 24 fiscal policy.
So let me open it for questions, comments, observations. I mean, it's an excellent document, really, really good. So I would entertain a motion to approve the city mission statement and the FY 2024 fiscal policy.
So moved.
Seconded.
Voice vote, or can we go to our attorney? Is this a roll call?
Voice vote.
Voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? There being none, the fiscal policy and mission statement are approved. Thank you. Thank you very much. Moving on, the police and fire pension funding update. So Director Holland?
Thank you very much, Chairman Morris. No action required this evening. This is just an update for you on police and fire pension funding, mostly due to the fact that the recommended levy is included in the tax levy later on the agenda. The items that we're going to cover this evening related to police and fire pension funding include a brief summary of the April 30, 2022 actuarial valuations. You may recall that we did change actuaries this year. Our independent actuary this year is Nyhart. And so this was our first year completing those valuations with that firm. Also, a brief summary of a joint meeting conducted July 18th of the city's pension subcommittee, as well as members of the Fire Pension Board and Police Pension Board. They received a presentation and overview from the actuary on the 4/30/22 actuarial valuations and considered funding options associated with those reports so that the actuary could complete and finalize the report. We'll talk a little bit about the 2022 levy recommendation coming out of the actuarial valuations and give you a very brief update on the pension consolidation. So first, by way of background, an independent actuary each year conducts an actuarial valuation of the police pension fund as well as the fire pension fund in order to determine a required levy contribution to meet the statutory required funding for police and fire pension funding. On the left side, funded ratio is the percentage of assets as a percentage of the total actuarial liability for benefits going out into the future. So it will tell you your funding status and give you a barometer of how well your assets are covering the future liability. So we've got 4 years of information here for both the police and fire pension funds. You'll note that in fiscal year 22, we saw slight decreases in both the police and fire pension funds. Police from 58.8% to 56.4%, and for fire from 78.2% to 70.39%. Those decreases were a result of the loss in investments that were experienced in fiscal year 22. So on the right, you've got 4 years of information of investment return. This is the actual investment return experienced in each of the last 4 fiscal years by fund. You'll note we had great news last year. We saw double-digit returns in fiscal year 21 as a result of the investment markets, 25.6% in police and 27.6% in fire. However, in fiscal year 22, primarily due to losses in January through April of this year, overall for fiscal year 22, the police assets lost 2% and the fire fund lost 5.2%. We have noted in these presentations the last several years that traditionally the Police Pension Board has been more conservative in their investment policy than fire. And so over time, we have noticed that in up markets, fire will typically outperform police, but will also experience more decline in down markets. I will note that this is the last year in which your local police and fire pension boards are handling the investments. So going forward, those investment returns will be based on the state consolidated funds. Also important to the actuarial funding is 5-year smoothing of investment returns. So rather than have required contributions fluctuate dramatically from year to year based on investment performance, the actuary smooths investment returns over 5 years. So the 25 and 26% return experienced in 21, as well as the losses in 22, are amortized over 5 years evenly. This just shows you the table that shows for police the 5-year smoothing and amortization of those returns over the last 5 years. And in that column, noted annual recognition. This is the portion of the investment returns in each of the last 5 years that go into the 2022 contribution requirement. So what you can see is that those significant positive returns in 21, that amortization of $1.3 million compensated for the losses in fiscal year 22 as well as underperformance in fiscal year 20. And so it doesn't create a significant increase in your contribution requirement from year to year. Over the last few years, we've talked a lot about the city's approach to funding police and fire pension obligations. There is a state requirement that is to fund your police and fire obligations 90% by 2040. The state has used a fixed 40-year amortization period for a number of years. Initially, the 40-year period was established in 1980 as a funding requirement of by 2020. In 1993, they shifted the 40 years and moved that deadline out to 2033. And they shifted it out a third time so that we now have a fixed 40-year period going through 2040. We also have what's commonly referred to as the ramp, which is that the state funding approach is to have lower contributions in early years, higher contributions in the out years. And so we were experiencing significant increases in our funding requirements of 8, 9, 10% per year. And you can see the blue line, which is showing the statutory model, would have us have significant increases all the way through the funding requirement deadline of 2040. So a few years ago, working with our actuary, the city developed a pension funding policy that would deviate from the statutory requirement and instead look at a phase-in of open amortization. It did involve a significant increase in early years of the contribution, so you see that with the orange line. So beginning in 2016, the city significantly increased its contributions to both police and fire pension in order to bring that ramp down and experience more modest increases from year to year in the requirement. You'll see a crossover point there in 2025 where the orange and blue lines cross. At that point, the city's model is to move to a 15-year open amortization period. And what that means is each year the unamortized liability would be amortized over a 15-year period, so it would just reset and adjust each year. What have we accomplished to date? So the contributions through the current date have been $3.2 million more than the statutory requirement. In addition to that, in fiscal year 20, the council approved an additional contribution of $500,000, both to police and fire. So in this case, the police pension fund received $3.7 million more than the statutory minimum. However, the current funding model shows savings in the out years of $25.5 million, simply because those amounts are available to invest for a longer period of time and result in greater savings on the out years. So this was the first year, as I mentioned, that Nyhart served as our actuary. In July, when we did have the joint pension board meeting, the pension subcommittee received a presentation from Nyhart and looked at 4 funding options for the fiscal year 22 valuation. We talked a little bit about the model used last year and continuing that model. The third column was our current model of keeping 6.5% interest return assumption and 2% payroll growth, and continuing the model that we've used in the last 5 to 6 years. And then the fourth just being a statutory minimum to show the difference in contribution requirement based on the statutory model. So at this meeting, the pension subcommittee opted to continue the approach that we've been using the last few years, and directed Nyhart to complete the valuation reports with the third column. So the pension subcommittee recommendations for the finance committee consideration is to maintain the actuarial assumptions used last year, investment return of 6.5%, payroll growth of 2%, and to increase the 2022 levy 3% over the prior year. That 3% increase would generate an amount that's more than the contribution requirement outlined in the actuarial evaluations. Police would be increased by $255,000, fire would be increased by $296,000, but the pension subcommittee felt that it would continue our efforts towards moving more quickly to the phased-in open amortization, and also buffer somewhat against the investment losses experienced both in the last 4 months of fiscal year 22, and then what we've seen so far in the first few months of fiscal year 23. And then rather than adjust the investment return assumption, last year the pension subcommittee was considering bringing it down to 6.25 this year. But based on the consolidation, both consolidated funds, and just by way of background, the Public Act requiring consolidation was approved and effective by the state in January 1 of 2020. Set forth a 30-month period whereby all local police and fire pension boards, with the exception of Chicago, would join into 2 state-wide funds independent from the state of Illinois, but handled more on a basis similar to IMRF, the non-public safety, for investment purposes only. So your local police and fire pension boards continue to administer benefits and make benefit determinations for members in the local pension fund, but no longer have the responsibility for investing. So the city's fire assets were transferred November 1 of 2021, and the police assets were transferred June 1 of 2022. So the city no longer holds police or fire pension assets, investments. The Fire Pension Investment Fund adopted an investment return assumption of 7.125%, and the Police Statewide Fund adopted an investment return assumption of 6.8%. So the Pension Subcommittee would like to just wait and monitor the consolidated investment funds to see how they perform, both in down markets, which they're getting plenty of experience in this year, as well as up markets, to see where we might adjust our local investment return assumption for levy purposes. So with that completes the police and fire pension funding update. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
It's a lot of information, a lot of numbers, lots of money. But questions from anybody? Alderman Bushman?
Thank you, Chairman Morris. Could you go back to that graph that showed, yes, thank you very much. Am I correct to understand that the only other time we provide an additional contribution to the plan that was adopted about 6 years ago was the $500,000 in FY20?
Yes, although last year's levy did include an additional amount above the actuarial contribution amount. So I think it was the $175,000 for fire and $250 for police.
And that would bump up the red line at the early stage, causing the crossover point to occur earlier.
It would. Here we've reflected only the actuarial contribution requirement, so we didn't include the additional amounts.
So the red line does not reflect, does it reflect the FY20 $500,000?
It does not.
Would I assume then that in the current fiscal year, if you look at a black line or a purple line, some different color, that it would be then higher than the red line is showing here?
Yeah, if you look at the actual contributions made, they would be in excess of the orange line.
Would we still be looking at a pretty much a flat line going out to year 2040?
Yes. Yes, that's the goal, is to get us to the crossover point and then to maintain fairly level contributions all the way out to 2040.
The question I guess I'm struggling with is when we establish this plan, it seems like it's a great plan and something that we should be doing to even out the burden to our taxpayer over time. Obviously, it puts an earlier burden than otherwise would have been occurring on our taxpayer now. And here we're adding additional taxes to our taxpayer. Could you give me the rationale why staff thinks that is, or the pension committee thinks that is a good thing to do?
Primarily as a result of the investment performance. So based on the loss in fiscal year 22, the first few months are showing losses in fiscal year 23. Those additional contributions will help to offset the investment return that is not going to be generated.
And I'm looking at, too, the investment picture that has occurred up to date. Maybe
Yes.
today's an exception, but
Correct.
it has been a struggle out there from an investment standpoint.
Alderman Rummel?
Just for some comparison, do we know how the IMRF fund did this past fiscal year?
I do not off the top of my head, but I will note that they had a very good performance. They are calendar year based. So IMRF reports will be as of December 31st. So they had a positive return for calendar 21 because they didn't have to include the 4 months in 22 that we do for police and fire. So they're not really comparable based on timing.
So really, at this point, we don't have any way to effectively gauge whether the state is going to be any better at this investing than we have been locally, right?
Correct, but the Fire Consolidated Fund put out a great report several months ago showing investment fees. And one of the arguments for consolidating the investments is the economy of scale, and that investment management fees were going to be lowered by having a larger pool rather than the 358 police funds across the state. And they did demonstrate that their fees are coming in much lower than the individual local funds. So that's a positive, but they also have the benefit of less restriction on the types of investments. So under the previous approach, depending on the size of your local police or fire pension fund, you had certain requirements on what you could invest in. So the city had the largest, so over 10 million. Funds that were over $10 million in assets could invest 65% equities, 35% fixed. If you were smaller than 10 million, you were even more restricted on your equity investments. So the very small funds had a very large portion of fixed income in their portfolios and were just not generating anything these last few years. So in the consolidated fund, they can benefit by having much more exposure to equity investments.
Do you know what that percentage is?
No, because both consolidated funds have created an investment allocation path that has a short-term allocation and a long-term allocation. So both funds are transferring assets from the local funds into a more passive portfolio so that they can complete the transfers, and then they will gradually increase the amount of equity in their total portfolio.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think from a pension subcommittee standpoint, we've been pretty confident that we were on a good path with what we've developed with the actuaries and the smoothing of the contributions going forward. But now we're in a whole new world. So the thought is, let's just see how it goes. Let's give it a year or a little bit more, see how the returns are, see how the management is, and see what we're obligated to, if any, make up any difference. Hopefully we'll not have to do that. And continue with our pretty modest growth in the annual funding for the pension fund.
Do we switch actuaries on a regular basis, or
No,
was
but
this unusual?
no, we haven't, but go ahead.
We typically go out to RFP every 5 years, and we don't have a mandatory change. So the incumbent actuary did submit a proposal, but Nyhart, as a result of the RFP process, came in more competitive than Foster & Foster, which resulted in the change.
Mayor?
Just a quick comment on, normally you have fixed income investments like bonds to insulate you in a downturn. That has not been the case this year. Everybody's gotten clobbered. So I wouldn't be surprised if when the numbers finally do come in from IMRF, they're not very good either, because with interest rates going from 0.5 percentage point to 3.5 percentage points in 6 months, the value of bond portfolios has just gotten crushed. And so it's pretty much across the board. And if you read the pension press, which unfortunately I do, everybody's just licking their wounds. However, everybody also had perhaps the strongest year in history last year. So it's, that's why we look at it over a 5-year period. We don't get fixated on what happened yesterday. These are long-term plans, long-term investments. And my first question to Elizabeth earlier this week was, how are we doing? Do we push out that crossover point because of just, losses this year? And the answer is no, because we're not looking at it on an annual basis, really. We're looking at it on a 5-year rolling basis. So last year still probably overcompensates for what happened this year.
I would say the IMRF is well-funded. I think it's 98% funded, which is the public safety pension fund. And we're catching up in the public sector and public safety funds. Very good. Well, there's no vote on this. Any other questions, or we'll move on to the next item? Very good. So now we move on to the discussion on the property tax plan for next year. So Director Holub?
Thank you very much. So this is the first crack of the egg on the property tax levy. You'll be discussing the tax levy a lot over the next 6 weeks. This evening's request of the Finance Committee is simply to provide feedback on this initial estimate. Under the Truth in Taxation statute, the city is required to adopt an estimate of the tax levy. It's non-binding. But it does set forth whether or not there are going to be specific requirements, such as a public hearing and a black box notice, if the proposed levy increase is more than 5%. So that tax levy estimate would be presented at the November 7th City Council meeting. Again, that's a non-binding estimate. November 14th, will be your budget workshop. City Council Finance Committee will have the tax levy on the agenda that evening and have a more detailed discussion of the components of that tax levy for discussion by the Finance Committee. The November 21st City Council agenda will include first reading of the tax levy ordinance. And then the December 5th City Council meeting will include the tax levy ordinance final approval and public hearing if required. So you will have several opportunities to discuss the levy. This is just an initial estimate. The PTEL this year related to 2000 levies, the property tax extension limitation law, is 5%. That is driven by inflation. Under the PTEL, 5% is the highest, so although inflation was more than 5%, 5% is the cap in any given year on PTEL adjustments. What we did was went back and did some analysis on levy increases over time. So the box at the bottom shows the top line, what the PTEL was applicable in each year, starting with the 2014 levy. You'll note the 2014 levy is fiscal year 16 budget. So you're adopting your levy in December. That will be received in calendar year 23, but it will be fiscal year 24 revenue from a budgetary standpoint. So there's a 2-year lag. The second line on the table at the bottom just shows the cumulative PTEL over that period of time. So you can see that we've had years where the PTEL was as low as 0.7%, under 1%. And then, of course, over that time period, the 5% applicable to fiscal year 24 budget, the 2022 levy, is the highest we've seen in that time period. We wanted to compare the PTEL, the cumulative PTEL, to the actual levy increase. Also show the difference between the total levy and the Parks and Recreation Library levy, and also show the comparison over that time period of the compensation plan adjustment. Compensation plan adjustment is the percentage in each year that the salaries of non-bargaining unit employees increased in the pay plan each year. So over the 2014 to 2021 levies, the cumulative PTEL is 12.8%. The total city levy has increased over that time by 24.9%. However, the Parks and Recreation and the library components of the levy have been kept to PTEL each year. So they have cumulatively increased by the 12.8%. And the compensation plan adjustment cumulatively has increased by 19.5% over that time period. The box up at the top is to show of the 24.9 total levy increase for the city's levy, how that compared from different components. So you can see that the general fund portion, the IMRF/Social Security, so non-public safety pension, The parks, recreation, and special recreation and the library levy increases have been much less than the police and fire pension components, as well as the capital and debt components. So partially because of this changing approach to funding police and fire pension funding and the increased requirements to fund that liability, that has generated a large proportion of that 24.9% increase. And when we began in 2014 levy, we did not have a capital improvement levy. And so since that time, the city council has adopted a specific capital improvement levy. And so you can see that the increase from 2014 to 2021 in the capital area is also quite a bit higher than the other operating levies. So based on that, in the estimate that you see this evening, we have recommended that the parks and recreation and library levies both be increased at 5%, the PTEL, because they have been so limited over the period of time where the PTEL was very low. And they've had to find alternative funding sources to pay the compensation plan adjustments for employees that are budgeted in those areas. Any questions on that analysis?
I would just add that, if you could pull that back up, you can see that the compensation increases have been 19.5%, which is a big piece of the 24.9% that we increased over that same period of time. So the bulk of it is really compensation adjustments, which have been pretty minimal over that period of time on an annual basis. So.
Included in your packet, there are several tax levy schedules. I've summarized here for the slide just the attachment 3 because it kind of rolls in some various components that you see in earlier schedules included in the packet. A few things to note: the current estimated assessed valuation for the city as a whole based on Lake County current estimates is a 2.4% increase over the prior year. So some modest growth, but growth in the overall valuation of the city. So that does factor into this analysis. So this summary shows the different components of the city's total levy. And I'll just go through by section. The first is the general fund, which is the primary funding source for the general fund budget. As you know, the property tax represents a little over 50% of the total revenues in the general fund budget. The 3.84% recommended here is a 3% increase plus new construction. So the county provides us an estimate of valuation that's being added and placed on the tax rolls for the first time this year. That new growth, that new construction levy amount gets split between the general fund levy and the library levy, which is how we've traditionally handled that. So that is the difference between 3% and 3.84. As mentioned previously, the recommended increase for police and fire pension and what we've also included on IMRF is a 3% increase over the prior year levy to keep those components funded as noted to the right and as presented in the earlier update. That does exceed the actual valuation contribution requirement for police by $255,000 and for fire $296,000 as recommended by the pension subcommittee. Fire pension is 2.73 as a result of some change in the proportion of the fire pension levy that is restricted under PTEL and not restricted under PTEL. So overall, total pension fund increase recommended of 2.91%. Then we get into the other components, the operating budgets for recreation and parks recreation and parks IMRF Social Security levy, as noted, is recommended to increase by 5%, which is PTEL. The recreation and parks specific purpose levy is capped at $125 and doesn't change from year to year. Special recreation recommended at 5%, again consistent with PTEL. Capital improvements, in the 5-year forecast last year for the capital improvements fund, the levy for capital improvements was fairly flat. Included here for the committee's consideration is a recommendation to increase the capital improvements levy by $350,000 over the prior year. This is primarily recommended to begin to phase in the additional levy requirement of potential debt for the athletic field improvements. So the thought process here for staff is that if the athletic field improvements project does not proceed, you would have $350,000 to fund a non-funded project. As you know, year after year, we have many more capital requests than we have available funds. And so if that project did not proceed, $350,000 would be generated for additional pay-as-you-go capital projects. But it would, if debt is issued for the athletic field improvement project, we would have begun to phase in that additional debt service. Then with the library levies, both the library and library sites, that is 5%, which is PTEL. The 5.43 for the library levy is just their portion of the new construction added to the 5%. So an overall aggregate levy increase of 4.92. Below that line, we have the bond funds. These are all tax-supported outstanding bond obligations. Those debt service levies for next year are fairly constant compared to the prior year. And then you can see the total, grand total levy, the very last line item, shows an overall proposed levy increase of 3.86% over the prior year. So as noted, I'm happy to receive any comments, questions. We did not plan a detailed presentation or discussion. That will be on the November 14th agenda, but we did want to present this to get feedback from the Finance Committee before we provide the estimate on the November 7th City Council agenda.
Yeah, before we take any questions, I just wanted to comment that, as you can imagine, Director Holub and her staff have been very diligent and careful in their analysis of our financial situation and coming up with is a pretty modest increase in the face of 8+% inflation that we're expected to have this year. So that's a hats off to them. We're keeping, trying to protect our bond issue, our bond evaluation on the AAA bond rating by having a consistent financial performance, especially in light of if we do go ahead with any bond issues in the future. That's going to be very important. In an interest rate that's, as we just talked about, going up to 4+% on the federal funds, that's going to be a big issue. So having a robust financial situation is going to be important. So with that, I'm happy to let you ask questions of the director. There's a lot of information, it's complex, and there's a lot that goes into this, but questions? No? Alderman Bushman, sure.
Thank you, Chairman Morris. I'd like to just clarify a little bit this proposal to increase the levy by $350,000 in connection with potential bond issue for the athletic field improvements. I think, as you said, Director Holub, this matter has not been decided upon by the council. There are open items and issues that the council still needs to be decided. Just wanted to just confirm that by going forward with this levy and this proposal, that it really does not impact one way or another the decision-making process for the athletic fields.
That's correct, Alderman Bushman. And so we did include it in the capital improvements levy, recognizing that would become revenue available for any projects identified in the capital improvement fund that the council opted to fund for fiscal year 24. So it was not intended to presuppose the decision of the council on the athletic field improvements, but to provide an opportunity to begin to phase that amount in if the project did proceed.
Thank you for the clarification.
Mm-hmm. Alderman Rolla?
Well, similar to Alderman Bushman's question, for how many years would we be phasing in $350,000 to pay this bond issue?
So it will depend on the final amount of the project and the period over which it's financed. So at the point the council begins to consider whether that project is going to proceed and at what price, we will also look at financing options. We've looked at 10, 15, and 20 years. Depending on that, as well as the interest rate, that will determine the annual funding requirement for debt service. So it is difficult to anticipate that at this point.
So you didn't make any assumptions on, when you came up with this $350,000 number?
Nope, we did not.
This is just a random number that,
Correct.
just trying to figure out where we got
Yeah,
$350,000.
no, it is not, there wasn't any presupposed project amount or funding. I would say 350,000 is not going to fund it under any circumstances. And we have always assumed that the debt service would be phased in over multiple years, but we haven't determined how many years or how much it would be phased in each year.
And so when will we get a number? At our workshop, perhaps?
No, the design work is at about 70 to 80% complete. My expectation is once the design work is completed, then staff would go out and seek competitive bids for council to consider pricing. My sense is that probably won't happen until at least January at this point.
And we determine the levy finally when?
December 5th.
This would be a future decision after that's all completed.
And I'll defer to Director Holub on the timing of issuance of potential debt and when the first debt service payments are due, but there is a lag there, so even if the council move forward with issuing debt to finance that project, debt service payments would not be due for some time into the future.
Okay, thank you. And I want to compliment you on a very complete and understandable report. Thank you for breaking it down this way. It really is a lovely report, and I think we'll talk offline a little bit further. Thank you.
Certainly, no problem.
Available for questions at all times, so, thank you.
I'd like to point out that, $350,000 as a placeholder is less than 1% of the levy and less than half of 1% of our budget. So this is just, the idea is to have this in the system so that we don't have all of a sudden a big jump at some point in the future. So,
Very good. Thank you, Alderman. So we move on to the next item, which is the discussion on the investment program and the reporting of the assets of the investment program. So, Director?
Thank you. This is another informational item for you for any feedback, but as a result of the actions taken by the City Council earlier this year to revise the investment policy and to improve the benchmarks and segmentation of the city's investments, we have now begun to purchase investments using the eConnect Direct product with multi-bank securities that was approved by the City Council. We've begun initially just purchasing certificates of deposit, but with the beginning of those investment purchases, it did trigger a reporting requirement in the investment policy. And so for this evening's meeting, we just wanted to provide a draft report to get feedback from the Finance Committee on whether you like the format, whether it's the right amount and type of information that you would like to see, and how you might want to see this presented differently going forward. The investment policy requires an investment report to the City Council Finance Committee at least quarterly, but the staff's concept is that once we have a format that meets the Finance Committee's approval, we would just make this part of the flash report. And so you would actually get this each month as part of the flash report so that you can monitor the investments that we purchased. You can see how those rates compare with our deposits, what they're earning as far as an interest rate, but also at the bottom to include the benchmarks. So these were the approved benchmarks to give you a feel for what benchmarks are generating as a result of a rate as well. So this investment report shows the investments as of August 31st. We've tried to keep it simple. We've tried to aggregate it so that we don't have information by fund here. It's just total. It does not include, for example, police and fire pension assets because we don't have control over those. We don't monitor the investments and are not responsible for those investments. It does not include cemetery commission assets because the cemetery commission does that investing. And so all of that is set forth in the investment policy, but we did include that in the introduction at the top so that you do know what is included and what isn't included. I would just note probably the biggest obvious question is the operating cash of $82.5 million and the rate of 3%. You hear us talk about having a very good relationship with Lake Forest Bank and Trust, our primary deposit. And so this is why we haven't really needed to invest for a long time because of the low interest rate environment. State statutes prohibit us from investing any of these funds in equity products. They can only be fixed income investments. And Lake Forest Bank and Trust has offered us such a competitive rate on our deposits, and these assets are fully liquid and collateralized at 110%. There simply has not been a need for us to invest a lot of this. You can see as of August 31st, we're earning 3% on that money. And you can see below what we got as far as a coupon rate on the CDs we purchased to date. So especially with the anticipated increases in the Fed rate, every time the Fed rate is adjusted, our rate at Lake Forest Bank and Trust automatically adjusts. And so we get the benefit, especially in a rising interest rate environment, of receiving, very, very competitive rates on our deposits at the bank. And so to lock in these funds for 3 years at a 3.3% coupon rate in a rising interest rate environment doesn't seem to be in the best interest of the city. So with that, I will pause and answer any questions, but certainly are interested in hearing if this provides the information you'd like to see.
It's an exceptional job that the director's done in working with Lake Forest Bank and Trust, and thanks to the bank for working with us. It's quite a program and gives us a lot of comfort that we are well protected in the years ahead. No questions? Very good. Thank you, Director. That's an informational item. The remaining agenda is other business. I just throw it open in terms of the items on this, the flash report and et cetera, the treasurer's report. Any questions for the director about those reports? Or informational only, so.
Could I ask, just, I don't know if you could put it up there, but the real estate transfer volumes, can you put that graph up?
I don't have the slide.
No, okay. Could you
No.
comment on what's been going on in terms of transaction volumes and pricing in Lake Forest?
Certainly. So as expected, given the general real estate environment, we are down a little bit on the volume of transfers from the 2 previous years, which were simply off the charts. But a lot of that has to do with reduced inventory, rising mortgage rates, those kind of things. So while we've seen some decline in activity, what we are seeing that is very encouraging is continued increases in the per transfer amount. So as of September 30th, our average sale price for the fiscal year to date is $1.25 million per residential transfer. That's up compared to $1.03 million for fiscal year 22. So we're up about 25% in average transfer sale price compared to last year.
And if I remember correctly, while the volume of transactions is down from the last 2 years, it's still significantly above the run rate from prior years before COVID. So
It is, correct.
okay.
And what's our average housing value now in Lake Forest? That went up also, did it not?
Yeah, I actually haven't checked that. I would have to get a more current number. We were over 800,000, but I would have to see.
So when we go into our next budgeting, when we figure out the impact to the average taxpayer, I hope we will be looking at the increased average home value as well.
Yeah, so what we
Because
do
we've
is
been using
we,
800,000 for a while.
Yeah, sure.
because every individual home is going to vary, we typically use the overall EAV increase. So for this year, it's 2.4%. So in the household impact, we would increase the $800,000 home by 2.4% to do the impact on the average homeowner.
Great, thank you.
Very good. Other questions? The final item is an opportunity for the public who are here in the audience to address the Finance Committee with any questions or observations. I don't have any cards suggesting there is, but more than welcome to entertain those. If not, I think that brings us to the end of the Finance Committee meeting. Any last comments from the committee members? If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second? Second, it's a voice vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? There being none, the meeting is adjourned, and we'll start the city council meeting in about 5 minutes. So we got close to 45 minutes. Thank you, everybody.